Christmas Eve stripped the city of its illusions. Snow fell softly, almost kindly, as if trying to soften the sharp edges of a place that had never shown mercy. It dusted iron gates and black-tinted windows, slid across sidewalks stained by old sins, and settled on rooftops that had heard more gunshots than laughter. Inside an upscale restaurant glowing with gold light and rehearsed warmth, a man sat alone at a table meant for two. His name was Alejandro Cruz Velasco. At 32, he ruled an empire built on silence, fear, and obedience. His suit was tailored to perfection, his posture immovable, his expression carved from years of discipline that did not allow for softness. Men twice his age bowed their heads when he entered a room. Cities bent under his influence. Lives ended when he nodded once. Yet tonight, he waited. The reservation card on the table read 2 guests. The untouched glass of wine across from him reflected candlelight that never quite reached his eyes. This evening had never been his idea. The blind date had been suggested by his inner counsel, an image adjustment they'd called it. A carefully selected woman, neutral background, clean history. A public gesture meant to soften the rumors after a year of brutal consolidation and rivals who had vanished without funerals. Alejandro had agreed without interest, because interest had never been necessary for power. The phone vibrated. One short message. "I can't do this. You're not someone I want in my life. I'm sorry." Alejandro read it once, then again. Then he placed the phone face down beside his plate. No reaction crossed his face. No tightening of his jaw. No flicker of anger. Rejection should not have mattered. Men like him were not rejected. They were feared, obeyed, endured. And yet, something cold and unfamiliar settled in his chest. Not anger, not humiliation, loneliness. Because Christmas had always been the season that reminded him of everything he had never been allowed to have. Families, warmth, a table where people stayed. He lifted his glass, took a measured sip, and prepared to leave, until a voice cut through the low hum of the restaurant. A small voice, clear, curious, unafraid. "Can you be my new dad?" Alejandro froze. Slowly, he looked up. A little girl stood beside his table, no older than 6. Her red coat was buttoned wrong, one mitten missing, dark curls escaping from beneath a knitted hat that had seen better winters. Her eyes were wide, bright, and impossibly direct. She looked at him not as a kingpin, not as a monster, but as a man who looked lonely. Her name was Lucia Moreno. And in that moment, Alejandro forgot how to breathe. The restaurant seemed to fade. The clinking glasses, the murmured conversations, the soft music. All of it dissolved under the weight of that single, impossible question. A question that echoed with something buried deep inside him. Because once, long ago, he had asked something similar, and learned too early that men like his father did not protect. They destroyed. "Lucia!" Panic rushed across the room like a wave about to crash. A woman hurried toward them, her face drained of color, her eyes locked not on her daughter, but on the man she stood beside. Isabel Moreno Reyes knew exactly who Alejandro Cruz Velasco was. Everyone did. His name was not spoken casually. It was whispered. It was used as a warning, as a threat, as a sentence. Her hands trembled as she reached for Lucia, already forming apologies, already bracing for consequences that never ended well. "I'm so sorry," she said breathlessly, pulling her daughter back. "She didn't mean, she doesn't know. Please forgive." Alejandro did not move, did not speak. He only looked at the child as if she had struck him somewhere no blade ever had. Then, the air changed. Alejandro sensed it before he saw it. The doors opened. Men entered the restaurant with purpose in their stride and calculation in their eyes. Not diners, not tourists, predators. Men loyal to Ramon Calderon. Their gazes swept the room, assessing, searching. Isabel felt it too, though she didn't yet understand why her stomach twisted with sudden dread. She didn't know that her late husband's death had not been an accident. She didn't know he had laundered money. She didn't know a ledger was missing. And she didn't know that, in this moment, she and her daughter were no longer invisible. Before fear could fully claim her, Alejandro stood. The movement alone commanded attention. in full view of enemies, staff, and security cameras. He removed his coat and gently draped it over Lucia's small shoulders. The room held its breath. "She's with me," Alejandro said calmly. Then his gaze lifted to Isabel. "And so are you." It was a lie, spoken like a vow. A claim that challenged rival syndicates, fractured internal alliances, and placed a target on all three of them. But Lucia smiled, safe, certain, believing. And Isabel felt the ground beneath her life shift forever. As snow thickened outside, alliances would splinter, blood would be demanded, and a schoolteacher who feared monsters would be forced into the world of the most dangerous man in the city, all because of one question, and one answer that had not yet been spoken. What would you do if the most dangerous man in the city claimed you as his, just to protect you? Snow followed them out into the night. It clung to the shoulders of Alejandro's guards, softened the headlights of black vehicles lined like sentinels along the curb, and melted quietly into the hem of Isabel's worn boots as she walked faster than her fear could keep up with. Lucia's small hand was wrapped tightly in Isabel's glove. Alejandro walked ahead of them, not hurried, not tense, moving with the calm certainty of a man who understood that danger respected confidence more than speed. To the outside world, it looked like a simple escort. To Isabel, it felt like being swept into a current she did not understand and could not fight. She had heard the stories, everyone had, about Alejandro Cruz Velasco, how men disappeared after crossing him, how entire crews dissolved overnight, how protection from him was indistinguishable from possession. When the car door opened, Isabel hesitated. Lucia did not. She climbed in easily, trusting the warmth, the leather seats, the quiet, trusting the man who had wrapped her in his coat without being asked. Isabel followed because mothers learned early that fear came second. The vehicle pulled away smoothly, swallowed by the city. Behind them, the restaurant lights faded. Ahead of them rose steel gates and high walls crowned with discreet surveillance, Alejandro's estate, though no one ever called it that aloud. Inside, silence ruled. Not the empty kind, but the disciplined kind. The kind that listened. Isabel stood rigid in the grand entryway, Lucia tucked close to her side. She noticed the details immediately. The absence of personal photographs, the precise placement of furniture, the way even luxury felt controlled. This was not a home, it was a fortress. Alejandro removed his gloves slowly, deliberately, only then did he turn to face her. "You're safe here," he said. His voice was calm, measured, as if safety were something he dispensed regularly. Isabel nodded once, though her heart beat too fast for agreement. "I didn't mean for her to speak to you," she said quickly. She's curious. She doesn't understand." "I understood," Alejandro interrupted. The words were not sharp. They were quiet, almost careful. Lucia looked up at him, eyes bright despite the late hour. "You said we're with you," she said, matter-of-factly. Alejandro met her gaze. "Yes," he replied. That was all. Isabel felt something tighten in her chest. Not relief, not fear, but confusion. Men like him didn't offer reassurance to children. They didn't repeat promises. A housekeeper appeared, ushering Lucia gently away toward a guest room, warmed by soft lights and clean sheets. Lucia went without protest, already yawning, already trusting. When they were alone, the silence returned heavier. Alejandro gestured toward a seating area. Isabel remained standing. "I need you to tell me the truth," he said, "about your husband." The words landed like a quiet blow. Isabel's throat tightened. "My husband is dead," she said. "That's the truth." Alejandro studied her for a long moment, long enough for her to feel exposed, measured, weighed. "He laundered money," Alejandro said calmly, "for Ramon Calderon. When he disappeared, a ledger disappeared with him." Isabel's breath caught. "I didn't know," she whispered. And in that moment, the truth of it cracked through her voice. "I swear to you, I didn't know." Alejandro believed her, not because of her words, but because of her fear. Calderon's men would not stop searching. They would pressure her, threaten her. Eventually, they would reach Lucia. That was why Alejandro had stood in the restaurant, not out of kindness, but recognition. "You are under my protection," he said. "Both of you." Isabel's hands clenched at her sides. "And what does that cost?" she asked. Alejandro didn't answer immediately, because this was the moment where men like him usually named a price: money, bodies, silence, ownership. Instead, he said, "Nothing you don't agree to." The words startled her more than any threat could have. "There will be no force," he continued. "No obligation beyond what I set, and what you accept." Isabel searched his face for deception, and found none. Only restraint, as if something inside him were held back by iron discipline. "You'll stay here," Alejandro said. "Publicly, you will be associated with me. That alone will keep Calderon away." "And privately?" Isabel asked. "Privately," he said, "you live, you teach, you raise your daughter." It sounded too simple, too dangerous. "And when it's over?" she asked. Alejandro's gaze flickered, just once. "When it's over," he said, "you'll be free to leave." Isabel swallowed. She had entered this house expecting a cage. Instead, she was being offered shelter, with rules she did not yet understand. Somewhere down the hall, Lucia laughed softly in her sleep. Alejandro turned slightly toward the sound, his expression unreadable. In that moment, Isabel realized the truth she was too afraid to voice. This wasn't just protection, it was the beginning of something neither of them had planned. And Christmas Eve had only been the opening move. Morning arrived quietly, not with warmth, not with joy, but with control. Sunlight filtered through tall windows veiled in sheer curtains, touching marble floors that had never known clutter. The house woke the way its owner lived, precise, restrained, deliberate. Isabel woke before Lucia. It was instinct, not habit. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the silence reminded her. No traffic outside the window, no rattling pipes, no neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls. This place breathed differently. She rose slowly, checking on Lucia first. Her daughter slept peacefully beneath a heavy duvet, Alejandro's coat folded neatly on a chair nearby, as if it were something precious, rather than borrowed. Isabel felt a tightness in her chest. Safety should not feel this unfamiliar. Downstairs, the house was already in motion. Guards rotated shifts without sound. Staff moved efficiently, eyes lowered, as if the walls themselves demanded discretion. Alejandro waited in the dining room, not at the head of the table, but at the side. It was a small thing. It unsettled her more than a command would have. Breakfast was simple: fresh fruit, bread still warm, coffee poured but untouched. Alejandro didn't rush. He didn't dominate the space. He waited, as though giving her time to decide whether she would sit at all. Isabel sat. That was the first choice she made. "This arrangement," Alejandro said calmly, "needs structure." Isabel nodded once, bracing herself. He explained it not as a contract, but as boundaries. Publicly, she and Lucia would be seen with him. Dinners, events, appearances. Enough to make it clear that harm to them would be interpreted as an act of war. Privately, there would be distance. No assumptions, no entitlement, no touching. Not unless she asked. The words landed heavier than threats ever could. Alejandro made one thing clear above all else. Control would always remain hers. "You can say no," he said, "at any point." Men like him did not say things like that. Isabel searched his face again for manipulation and found only restraint sharpened to a dangerous edge. "What do you get out of this?" she asked. Alejandro didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated, because saying nothing would be a lie. Finally, he said, "Peace." The word sounded foreign in his mouth. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Lucia adapted first. Children always did. She explored the house without fear, asked questions without hesitation, and treated the guards like furniture, present, unremarkable, harmless. She ate more, slept better, laughed freely. Alejandro watched her from a distance, never intruding, never correcting, as if afraid that claiming the role she offered would make it disappear. Isabel noticed. She noticed how he adjusted his schedule to be present at breakfast, how he softened his voice without realizing it, how he never raised it at all when Lucia was nearby. This was not the man the city feared, but she never forgot that he could be. Calderon's shadow loomed constantly. News came in fragments. A warehouse burned. A message intercepted. A warning delivered to the wrong doorstep and silenced before it could be repeated. Alejandro absorbed it all without visible reaction. Isabel absorbed it in the way her shoulders tensed when Lucia left the room. One evening, Alejandro introduced the first lesson. He didn't call it that out loud, but Isabel understood. It was simple. Dinner alone, no guards in sight, no agenda, just presence. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Alejandro observed the way Isabel held herself, alert, careful, used to taking up as little space as possible. "You don't have to disappear here," he said quietly. The words struck deeper than he intended. She didn't respond, because disappearing had been how she survived. Another evening, another lesson. Conversation, not about danger, not about the past. About books, about teaching. About the way Lucia saw the world as something still worth trusting. Alejandro listened, not like a man waiting to speak, but like a man storing something precious. The intimacy crept in unnoticed, not through touch, but through attention. Isabel realized something frightening. She felt safest when Alejandro was near, not because of the guards, not because of the walls, but because he watched, carefully, constantly, as if her well-being had become part of his discipline. One night, Lucia fell asleep on the couch beside him, her head resting against his arm. Alejandro didn't move, didn't breathe deeply, didn't dare disturb the fragile weight of it. When Isabel saw them like that, danger and innocence sharing the same stillness, her fear shifted into something else, something warmer, something far more dangerous. This arrangement was no longer just protection. It was a slow, deliberate crossing of lines that neither of them had named. And the deeper Isabel stepped into Alejandro's world, the more she sensed the truth forming beneath every quiet moment. The most dangerous thing about Alejandro Cruz Velasco was not his violence. It was his restraint, and how close she was to wanting him to let go. The city noticed. It always did. Alejandro Cruz Velasco did nothing quietly, not because he was careless, but because visibility was a weapon. And when he stepped into public spaces with Isabel at his side, the message spread faster than blood rumors ever could. She was seen entering private elevators, leaving black sedans, standing beside him beneath chandeliers and surveillance lights, always composed, always untouched, always claimed. At the first event, Isabel felt the weight of hundreds of eyes before she understood why. The ballroom glittered with wealth polished to cruelty. Politicians, financiers, men who smiled with their teeth and calculated with their eyes. Alejandro's hand rested at the small of her back. Not possessive, not intimate, protective, the difference mattered. Publicly, he was everything the city feared, dominant, unyielding, absolute. Conversations bent toward him. Space cleared when he moved. Men nodded, women watched, and no one questioned why a schoolteacher now stood at his side. Privately, he spoke little. He asked if she was cold, if the noise was too much, if she wanted to leave. Each question was an offering of control he never reclaimed. Isabel learned the rhythm of these nights. Smile when spoken to, stay close, say nothing that could be used, and never forget that this was performance. But performances had consequences. A man approached her at the bar, too familiar, too bold. His smile lingered where it shouldn't have. His questions edged toward curiosity that wasn't innocent. Alejandro noticed immediately. He didn't interrupt. He waited, watched, measured. When the man's hand brushed Isabel's arm, Alejandro stepped in, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. The conversation ended. The man paled. Later, Isabel heard that he'd been escorted out, quietly, permanently removed from certain circles. Alejandro never mentioned it. That was the most unsettling part. Violence, when it came, was controlled, surgical, as if emotion had no place in it, as if he were protecting something fragile, and would burn the world down without ever raising his voice. Back at the house, silence reclaimed its place between them. Alejandro loosened his cufflinks. Isabel removed her heels. The distance between them remained measured, intentional. "You did well," he said. The approval stirred something unwelcome in her chest. I didn't do anything, she replied. You endured, he said. That's not nothing. She didn't know how to answer that. The nights continued. Dinners with powerful men who tested boundaries, events where Isabel felt like both shield and vulnerability, and always Alejandro watching. Jealousy surfaced in ways neither of them named. Isabel noticed how his jaw tightened when men lingered too long. Alejandro noticed how Isabel stiffened when other women assessed her, calculating her value, her weakness, her place beside him. Still, he never touched her, never crossed the line he had drawn himself. That restraint became its own kind of tension. One night, Calderon made his move, not with bullets, with presence. A familiar face appeared at a gala, too close, too intentional, a reminder that the ledger was still missing, that Isabel's protection was being tested. Alejandro felt it immediately. He didn't react, not yet. The message came later, delivered through an intermediary, wrapped in polite language and implied threats. Alejandro responded the only way men like Calderon understood, by shutting down 3 of his operations before dawn, by making it clear that Isabel Moreno Reyes was not leverage. She was a line no one crossed. Isabel sensed the shift the next morning. The air felt heavier, the guards more alert. Alejandro more distant, not colder, but focused in a way that frightened her. You're not safe leaving the house today, he said. I don't leave often, she replied. His gaze lingered on her longer than necessary. That will change, he said quietly. Eventually. The words unsettled her, because part of her wanted them to. Because part of her feared what she would lose when they did. That night, as she tucked Lucia into bed, her daughter asked a simple question. Is Alejandro lonely? Isabel didn't know how to answer. Because loneliness clung to him like a second shadow. Because he stood between danger and safety, without ever stepping fully into either. Because she was starting to feel something she hadn't prepared for. Not love, not yet, but trust. And in Alejandro's world, trust was the most dangerous currency of all. If someone protects you fiercely in public but keeps distance in private, does that make them safer or more dangerous to your heart? The house learned new habits, or perhaps it revealed old ones. Alejandro adjusted his schedule without announcement. Meetings moved earlier. Evenings ended sooner. The staff noticed but did not comment. In his world, change was observed, not questioned. The first lesson came disguised as routine. Breakfast together, not formal, not strategic. No guards within earshot. Just the soft clink of cutlery and the quiet presence of another person at the table. Alejandro did not dominate the space. He asked Isabel what Lucia liked in her lessons. He listened as she spoke about children who learned better through patience than discipline. About how kindness, repeated long enough, could reshape fear. Alejandro absorbed the words as if they were instructions. Lucia sat between them, swinging her legs beneath the table, blissfully unaware of how carefully both adults measured every moment around her. She reached for Alejandro's hand once. He stiffened, just barely, then allowed it. The contact lasted less than a second. But Isabel saw the way his breath changed. That night, the lesson was silence. They sat in the same room, no conversation required. Alejandro read reports. Isabel graded papers. Lucia colored on the floor, humming to herself. It felt almost normal, which frightened Isabel more than danger ever had. Alejandro never initiated touch, never invaded her space. Instead, he created moments where distance shortened naturally, a chair pulled closer, a door held open longer than necessary, a coat placed over her shoulders when she forgot hers. Each gesture carried intention without entitlement. Each one asked a question without words, and each time Isabel answered by staying. Lucia, oblivious and perceptive all at once, began calling Alejandro Papa when she thought no one was listening. The first time, Alejandro pretended not to hear. The second time, he corrected her gently. The third time, he did nothing at all. Isabel noticed how he watched Lucia sleep some nights, from the doorway, never crossing the threshold, as if stepping fully into the role might break something fragile, as if he were afraid of wanting it too much. The danger did not disappear. It never did. Reports continued. Calderon retreated, regrouped. Violence remained just out of reach, like a held breath waiting to be released. Alejandro tightened security. Isabel felt it in the way his gaze followed Lucia more closely, in the way his voice lowered when giving orders. Protection was no longer abstract. It was personal. One evening, Alejandro invited Isabel to walk the gardens. Not as a performance, not as an event. Just the two of them beneath string lights, softened by falling snow. "You can stop this at any time," he said quietly. She knew what he meant. "I know," she replied. But neither of them moved away. The lesson that night was trust. He told her about his childhood, not in detail, not with emotion, but enough. About a father who taught obedience through fear. About a mother who disappeared into silence. About learning early that love was leverage, and therefore weakness. Isabel listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said only, "Lucia is safe with you." The words struck deeper than praise. Alejandro said nothing, because for the first time, he believed it. The final lesson of the week came without warning. Lucia fell asleep on the couch again, her head resting against Alejandro's shoulder. This time, he didn't freeze. He adjusted slightly, carefully, as if the weight of a child's trust were heavier than any crown he'd ever worn. Isabel watched from the doorway, heart tight, breath shallow. This was not the arrangement she had agreed to. This was something else, something warmer, something far more dangerous. Alejandro looked up and met her gaze. No command, no question, just an unspoken acknowledgement that lines were shifting. And neither of them reached to stop it, because the lessons were no longer about proximity. They were about surrender. And the most dangerous thing was no longer the men watching from the shadows. It was how close Isabel was to wanting this life, and how close Alejandro was to losing control over something he never meant to need. Desire arrived quietly, not as hunger, not as heat, but as absence. Isabel noticed it the first morning Alejandro wasn't at the breakfast table. The chair across from her remained empty, the coffee untouched. Lucia asked where he was, and Isabel answered too quickly, as if convincing herself as much as her daughter. "He's working," she said. The truth was simpler. Alejandro was pulling away, not because he wanted distance, but because he recognized the danger in wanting. Meetings stretched longer, his presence grew intermittent. When he did appear, he kept the space between them intact, formal, precise, controlled. Isabel felt the shift immediately, and with it, a realization she had not prepared for. She missed him, not his protection, not the safety. Him. The awareness unsettled her more than fear ever had. It meant the arrangement had changed without either of them agreeing to it. It meant obligation was no longer the reason she stayed. Lucia sensed it too. She asked why Alejandro no longer read to her at night. She asked if he was angry. Isabel had no answer. Alejandro watched from a distance as Isabel moved through the house, still careful, still composed, but quieter now. The absence he created echoed louder than presence ever had. He had known this moment would come. Desire was not part of the plan. It complicated strategy. It weakened control. And worst of all, it gave Calderon leverage he had never intended to offer. The warning came that evening. Not directly, not crudely. A car idled too long outside the gates. A familiar insignia appeared where it shouldn't have. A reminder that Ramon Calderon was watching and that he had noticed the shift as well. Alejandro acted immediately. Security doubled. Routes changed. Names erased. Isabel felt the tension coil through the house like a live wire. That night, Alejandro found her alone in the library. "You're leaving," he said. The words struck without softness. "Temporarily," he clarified. "A safe location. Calderon is testing limits." Isabel turned to face him, heart pounding. "And Lucia?" "She comes with you." The thought of separation, of him not being there, hit harder than she expected. "And you?" she asked. Alejandro hesitated. "I stay," he said. The answer was logical. It was also unacceptable. "This was never supposed to be about us," he continued, voice steady. "You were meant to survive. That's all." Isabel stepped closer. "For you maybe," she said, quietly, "but not for me." The space between them narrowed, not by command, by choice. Alejandro's restraint cracked, not outwardly, not violently, but enough for truth to surface. I think about losing you, he admitted. Every day. The confession was simple, devastating, because men like Alejandro did not admit fear. And because the fear was not of death, but of absence. The near kiss happened by accident. A breath held too long. A movement misjudged. Close enough for Isabel to feel the heat of him. Close enough for Alejandro to smell the familiar soap she used. The quiet warmth that had become part of his nights. He stopped himself. Stepped back. This can't continue, he said. The words hurt more than rejection ever could. Isabel nodded once, because if this ended, it had to end cleanly, because anything less would destroy them both. Then the violence came. Gunfire shattered the stillness beyond the gates. An explosion echoed, controlled, contained, but unmistakable. Calderon's men had pushed too far. Alejandro moved instantly, orders given, defenses activated. Isabel was ushered away, Lucia gathered into safety. But Isabel saw it then, not the brutality, the resolve. Alejandro did not fight like a man defending territory. He fought like a man defending family. The attack was repelled. The message delivered, but the cost lingered. Later, when the house settled into silence again, Alejandro found Isabel where she waited, hands clenched, eyes steady despite fear. I won't let them take you, he said. Not as a threat, as a promise. And I won't leave, Isabel replied. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. In that moment, obligation dissolved completely. What remained was choice, and desire sharpened by the knowledge that love, once chosen, would be the most dangerous risk either of them had ever taken. Freedom did not arrive with celebration. It came quietly, like a door left open. The aftermath of the attack left the house alert, but intact. Calderon had been pushed back, not defeated, but reminded. Messages traveled quickly in Alejandro's world, and this one was unmistakable. Isabel and Lucia were untouchable. Alejandro ensured it personally. Routes were rerouted, names removed from databases, assets shifted without delay. The protection surrounding them became invisible rather than overwhelming, the kind that didn't smother but never slept. Then, one evening, Alejandro called Isabel into his office. The room was spare, functional, designed for decisions that ended lives and started wars. On the desk lay a folder. Isabel recognized its weight before she opened it. Legal documents, passports, property deeds, bank transfers already completed. You're free, Alejandro said. No conditions followed, no waiting clause, no hidden expectation. Everything he had promised on Christmas Eve, he had delivered. You can leave tonight, he continued. There's a house prepared, a new school lined up, security that answers to no one but you. Isabel's hands trembled as she turned the pages. There it was. The end of the arrangement, the end of the danger, the end of him. Alejandro stood still as she read. He didn't watch her face, didn't wait for gratitude. He had already made his peace with whatever she chose. This is what I wanted for you, he said. From the beginning. Isabel looked up. And what do you want, she asked. Alejandro hesitated. That alone was an answer. I don't get to want, he said finally, not without consequences. The truth of it pressed down between them. Alejandro had not offered freedom to test her loyalty. He had offered it to prove something, to her and to himself, that whatever grew between them had not been built on fear. Isabel didn't answer right away. That night she packed, not in silence, not in panic, but slowly, deliberately. Lucia helped, chattering about the new place, the new room, the new beginning. Alejandro did not interfere. He watched from a distance, every instinct screaming at him to stop it. But control meant letting go. At dawn, the car was ready. Lucia climbed in first. Isabel turned back toward the house, toward Alejandro standing on the steps, hands clasped behind his back, face unreadable. He had given her everything. Now he gave her space. She stepped forward and stopped. This was the moment. Not for romance, for truth. I need to know, Isabel said quietly, that if I stay, it's not because you saved us. Alejandro met her gaze. It won't be, he said. And that if I leave, she continued, you won't come after us. I won't, he replied. They stood there, danger and freedom balanced on a single breath. Then Isabel made her choice. She closed the car door, not from inside, from the outside. Lucia looked up, confused. Isabel smiled at her. We're staying, she said. Alejandro didn't move, didn't speak, didn't dare believe it. Isabel walked back toward him, not hurried, not hesitant. Each step stripped away obligation. Each one affirmed desire. I choose this, she said. Not because I'm afraid, not because I owe you, but because I want a life where my daughter is safe, and where I don't pretend I don't care. Alejandro's control finally fractured. Not into chaos, into honesty. He reached for her hand, waited. Isabel placed her hand in his. The contact was simple, irrevocable. Behind them, the gates remained open. Freedom still offered, but no longer needed. Because love, once chosen without chains, was stronger than any empire Alejandro had ever built. Choosing love did not make the world gentler. It made the consequences clearer. The morning after Isabel stayed, the house did not celebrate. There were no smiles of victory, no quiet relief. Alejandro understood better than anyone that love did not erase danger, it redefined it. Calderon would not retreat again. He would escalate. And this time, Alejandro would not allow Isabel or Lucia to remain adjacent to his violence. He would remove the violence itself. The decision came without drama. Alejandro summoned his inner circle, not in anger, not with threats, but with finality. Operations were severed, roots dismantled. Long-standing alliances were restructured or abandoned entirely. The men who had built their power on fear resisted, quietly at first, then openly. Alejandro listened. Then he ended the conversations. Not with blood, but with consequence. Money was frozen. Access revoked. Names erased. For the first time in his reign, Alejandro chose loss over control. Isabel saw the change in small, undeniable ways. He came home earlier. He asked about Lucia's day and waited for the answer. He learned how she took her tea. Which stories made her laugh? Which fears woke her at night? Lucia, sensing permanence, tested boundaries. She asked if Alejandro would come to her school event. He did, sat in the back, clapped softly, froze when she ran into his arms afterward without hesitation. That was when it happened. The moment Alejandro had avoided since Christmas Eve. Lucia called him Dad, not accidentally, not playfully, deliberately. The word settled into Alejandro's chest like a vow he hadn't known he wanted. That night, he stood in the doorway of her room long after she slept. Isabel watched him. You don't have to be perfect, she said quietly. Just present. Alejandro nodded once. That was something he could learn. The legal process began quietly. No announcements, no headlines. Just documents signed and verified. Alejandro Cruz Velasco became Lucia's legal father on paper, the same way he had already become one in practice, by choosing her safety over his power. Calderon responded exactly as Alejandro expected, with blood. An attempted hit, not on Alejandro, on something symbolic. A school fundraiser, a message meant to remind him that peace came at a price. Alejandro stopped it before it reached the doors. This time, he didn't retaliate with fear. He retaliated with exposure. Evidence delivered to the right hands. Financial trails unraveled. Calderon's empire began collapsing under its own weight. It wasn't quick, it wasn't clean, but it was final. Alejandro paid the cost in influence, in territory, in reputation. But what remained was something he had never possessed before. A future. Isabel saw him differently now. Not as a protector standing between her and danger, but as a man standing beside her, vulnerable and learning. Some nights, Alejandro woke from dreams he didn't remember how to explain. Isabel didn't ask him to. She stayed, held the quiet. Lucia slept peacefully down the hall, unaware that her belief had reshaped an empire. Alejandro knew the truth then. Redemption wasn't found in grand gestures. It was built in repetition, in choosing restraint, in showing up, and in understanding that the most powerful legacy he could leave behind was not fear, but safety. Peace never arrived all at once. It fractured. Calderon's empire collapsed publicly, accounts frozen, allies exposed, roots seized. But men like Ramon Calderon did not surrender quietly. When power was stripped away, what remained was rage sharpened into something reckless. Alejandro understood this. It was the most dangerous phase. A man with nothing left was not bound by reason. The warning came too late. A single breach, a trusted name turned, a failure born not of weakness, but of desperation. Alejandro was not at home when it happened. Isabel felt the shift before she understood it. The house snapped into motion, guards moving faster, voices lowered. Lucia swept into safety. Then the call came. Alejandro's convoy had been hit. Not a full assault. A message, the kind meant to wound, not kill. Isabel waited in silence that stretched until it hurt. She had lived with fear before. This was different. This fear had a name. When Alejandro returned, it was just before dawn. Blood marked his sleeve, not his own, but close enough to make her hands shake. He waved off the medics, dismissed the guards, came to her as if drawn by something stronger than pain. "I'm fine," he said. Isabel didn't believe him, but she understood what he was really saying. "I'm still here." The next decision was not strategic. It was personal. Alejandro chose to end it, not with a war, but with finality. He delivered the last evidence himself, placing Calderon in a position where there would be no negotiation left. No shadows to retreat into. No leverage remaining. And then he waited. For the retaliation he knew would come. It did. At the estate, not during the day. At night, when Lucia slept. The attack was swift, violent, close. Alejandro fought not as a kingpin, but as a father. He intercepted the threat before it reached the inner corridors. The cost was high. A blade where a bullet would have been fatal, pain that nearly dropped him. Isabel reached him before the guards did, held him as the world narrowed to breath and blood and fear. For the first time, Alejandro allowed himself to lean into her, to be held. Calderon was captured within the hour. This time, there was no spectacle, no drawn-out justice, just an ending. The city exhaled quietly the next morning, barely noticing the absence of a name it had learned to fear. Recovery was slow. Alejandro healed in increments, physically first, then something deeper. Isabel stayed. Lucia learned what it meant to be afraid, and then to be reassured. Alejandro resigned from what remained of his criminal empire publicly, decisively, without apology. What he kept was legitimate, transparent, legal. The past did not vanish, but it no longer dictated the future. One evening, as Alejandro stood in the garden, watching Lucia chase falling leaves, Isabel joined him. "I was ready to lose you," she said quietly. Alejandro looked at her. "I was ready to die," he replied, "but not to leave you." The truth of it settled between them. Love had cost them blood, but it had also saved them from becoming something worse, because the last price demanded by violence had been paid, and neither of them intended to owe it anything ever again. Time did not erase the past, but it taught it where it belonged. The city learned to say Alejandro Cruz Velasco's name differently, not in whispers, not in warnings, but in headlines tied to legitimate businesses, restored neighborhoods, and quiet investments that rebuilt places once hollowed out by fear. Power, redirected, became protection. Alejandro no longer moved with an entourage. The fortress softened into a home. Security remained, but it blended into normalcy, no longer the center of everything. Isabel returned to teaching. At first, it felt unreal, standing in front of a chalkboard again, guiding children through lessons about kindness and patience, while knowing the kind of man who waited for her at home. But the two worlds no longer collided. They complemented. Lucia flourished. She slept without nightmares, laughed without hesitation, introduced Alejandro as her father without fear of correction. Alejandro learned fatherhood the same way he learned everything else, with discipline and intention. He attended school events, learned routines, sat through moments of uncertainty without trying to control them. He failed sometimes. He apologized. That mattered more than perfection ever could. One winter evening, years after that Christmas Eve, the three of them stood beneath falling snow in the quiet garden behind the house. No guards nearby, no tension in the air, just stillness. Alejandro took Isabel's hands, There was no grand proposal, no speech rehearsed for power, only truth. "I don't want to protect you anymore," he said quietly. "I want to walk with you." Isabel smiled. She had crossed far more dangerous thresholds than this. Their commitment was small and private, a ceremony with few witnesses. Lucia scattering petals with solemn responsibility. Vows spoken without fear. Isabel didn't promise to save him. Alejandro didn't promise to change overnight. They promised honesty, presence, choice, every day. Later, as the evening settled into warmth and quiet laughter, Isabel stepped away for a moment. She watched Alejandro kneel to Lucia's height, listening intently to a story only she seemed to understand. And she reflected on the night she had stumbled into a glowing restaurant seeking warmth, on the man she had feared, on the lie spoken like a vow that had reshaped everything. She realized then that love had not erased Alejandro's darkness. It had given it somewhere to end. In choosing him, she had not chosen danger, she had chosen growth. And Alejandro, raised by monsters, shaped by violence, had learned that legacy was not built by fear, but by what you chose to protect. As snow fell softly once more, the city continued on, unaware of the quiet victory unfolding behind closed gates. A man had become a father, a woman had chosen freely, and a child's question had rewritten the fate of them all. But even peaceful legacies are tested, and some shadows never fully disappear. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps me bring you even more emotional, heartwarming stories filled with love, tension, and unforgettable moments. Stay tuned. More beautiful stories are on the way.